Hey everyone, it's Helen from S&B Deal Hunter. Today we have Dominick Blue with us, a U.S. Marine Corps veteran who worked in tech and then bought two businesses last year in 2024, an air duct cleaning business and an HVAC business after looking at 2,500 deals. Really looking forward to hearing Dominick's story. Dominick, it's great to have you on today.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Helen.
I guess let's first talk about your background. You obviously have done a lot of different things. What brought you into sort of the acquisition entrepreneurship space? What were you doing before? Tell us a little bit more there.
Yeah. So I think it's the quintessential story of found entrepreneurship at a young age, right? In high school, I was wholesaling candy. I had a lawn mowing business, all the typical things. And then I started my professional career in the U.S. Marine Corps. Spent 11 years there, and then transitioned to tech, which, like we were saying earlier, I think everybody that goes to tech when they think entrepreneurial they go 0 to 1, try a startup, which is what I did. I had an angel-backed startup a few years ago and shut that down due to health complications with my wife. And when I was looking for the next, entrepreneurial endeavor that I wanted to focus on, I came across, ETA. And Acquiring Minds was actually the podcast that I came across that introduced me to ETA. And then went out and read, how to buy a small business, the HBR guide, and then Buy Then Build with Walker Deibel. I think the two Bibles of ETA, and then away I went on my search, and that started in 2023.
Wow, and were you doing this full time? Were you searching full time, or where were you sort of at then?
Yeah, so there's the age old argument of, do you quit your job and do search full time, or do you figure out how to do it part time? I think because I mean I ended up looking at over 2,500 deals, so I feel like it was full time, but I had my day job at the same time. So yeah, you can imagine what that was like trying to coordinate those two.
Wow, crazy. I guess, what did your search criteria look like early on? What kind of deals, like, tell us about some of the deals you looked at, and
Yeah.
where were you sort of finding them? Was it mostly like on market broker deals? Were you like looking off market? What did that look like?
Yeah, so I was obviously in the beginning, I didn't really have a thesis. I was just kind of, doing the typical biz buy sell. Let me just go page after page, find things that were what I thought were interesting to me. Over time, realized that I was definitely, as I started developing my thesis, I realized, being geographically constrained was a big one because I have a family. And leveraging my USC network in Southern California was very important. Realized I wanted to be in a home services type business. That's pretty typical for ETA folks. HVAC, plumbing, electrical. Those are like the gold standard, I guess, in ETA. So I wasn't too different from other folks in that idea. And then really the last piece was for the thesis was deal size. And because I was a self-funded searcher, I wasn't raising outside capital. I was on the lower end looking at, 500 to 750 in SDE. I came in for my two deals. I came in just below that for both of those deals, which I was okay with. But yeah, that was what my thesis was. So geographically constrained to Southern California, looking for home service businesses, and then 500 to 750 in SDE. Yeah, no off market deals. And then when I started, really how I built out my network was I started with Biz Buy Sell and then used that as a way to jump over to meeting brokers. Then I moved to broker deals, and through the brokers started meeting bankers who were like in our region. And it was actually between the brokers and the bankers that I started getting deal flow from. And that's actually how I found the two deals that I ended up closing on was through a combination of a banker who I built a relationship with introduced me to a deal, and then a broker introducing me to a deal.
And tell us about, I think a lot of folks just sort of work with business brokers or look at listings that are publicly available, like on a biz by sell. But tell us the difference between a broker and a banker from your opinion.
Yeah, yeah, great. Banker is, what it sounds like. They're the one that kind of, depending on who you meet in the bank, like I was dealing with, I forget his official title, but effectively he was kind of the front end sales rep who helped you pre-qualify a deal, and then they would kind of figure out what loan product worked best. And once they got you qualified, they would hand you off to the internal team that would do the actual loan processing and stuff like that. For a broker, you could think of a broker like a real estate agent, but for businesses, right? They're the ones who kind of handle the transaction between the buyer and the seller. They're the ones who are listing and pricing businesses for sale. So they're the car salesman, if you will, for the
Yeah.
business buying world.
Got it.
That's
No,
how I know.
yeah, I thought, no, I thought you were talking about like working with investment bankers, but
Ah, right.
no,
Yeah,
no, that makes sense. Why? Yeah, no, that makes a
yeah,
lot of sense. And did you, submit multiple LOIs before you got those two sort of under LOI? What did that look like? Was this process pretty fast for you? How long did it take? I mean, two deals at once is not easy. So I'll ask about that
yeah,
next, but
yeah. So let's see, the first LOI I submitted was probably 3 or 4 months into my search. It was actually for a landscaping business. Ultimately, that fell through. I walked away from that deal. But really, my approach was because I like moving fast, and I like making the seller know that I was serious. So I really didn't submit a lot of LOIs. I tried to do a really good job of disqualifying deals before submitting LOIs. So I mean, that's part of the reason why I looked at so many deals was because I was disqualifying using my own parameters. So I actually only submitted one LOI officially, and got a deal under LOI before finding my first deal, which was about 6 months later. So I started my search in March, and then the first deal that I actually closed on, I found in July of
oh wow.
2023. And then it took me, there were some complications in the 11th hour, as we all expect. So it took me 6 months to close that deal. So I didn't close until January of 2024. Um, and it wasn't until probably three-quarters of the way through that deal that I found deal number two. And that actually came again from deal flow from a broker that I had built a relationship with, who knew I was in the market for those types of businesses. So, as a side note, just to the listeners, I think it's really important when you develop your thesis to make sure you're advocating for that thesis every time you talk to somebody, because you don't know where your deal might come from. And the more people that are aware of your thesis, the more advocates you have for folks sending you deals. It also shows that you're very serious, that you've put time into considerations for what types of deals you're looking for.
No, 100%. That makes sense. And did you always know you were gonna, were you always open to two deals at the same time? This is your first or foray into buying a business. 'Cause
Yeah.
that feels like it could be daunting, but I'm curious what was going through your mind.
Yeah, in a lot of ways it wasn't bad, but I think that's because I got lucky. And here's why. So the first deal was the air duct cleaning business, and I knew strategically I wanted to use that business as a way to back in. They call it backing into an industry, and I wanted to back into the HVAC industry. So buying deal number one gave me like the management infrastructure I needed to do bolt-ons. So deal number two was substantially smaller, because what we see in home services is a lot of key man type businesses where the owner wears multiple hats. You really can't replace them. So because I knew I needed a management structure, I couldn't just buy a company that size by itself. So having the first deal lined up is really what set me up for the second deal. I had no intentions of doing two deals. I had no plans for it. It just so happened that one of the brokers I knew, his deal was coming online, and he said, "I think it's actually a great fit for a bolt-on if you're interested." And so I ended up using the same lending team to do both deals, which really simplified everything for me because you don't have to resubmit all your documentation because they already have it, and it made it a little bit easier. So I think I was lucky in that regard.
No, that's interesting. And tell us, I mean, even before that, you spoke about your parameters while looking at those 2,500, deals. What
Mm.
were some of the parameters you were sort of looking to check off?
Yeah, yeah. I think the some of the big ones, which is probably pretty common among other searchers, is customer concentration. Looking at um, really any red flags as it relates to pre-COVID or post-COVID type financial performance. That's actually something that I learned later on, was really understanding a spike up during COVID or a dip in COVID. Both of those are actually bad. Um, and I didn't realize that until later, but that's I think another really important one. Um, the industry depends on depending on the industry, whether it's trying to look at, there's in the home services world, there's like home cleaning businesses that really focused on like COVID decontamination. So understanding like, yeah, that's probably not going to be as important in the coming years. So, those are other flags that I would use to disqualify a business. There's flags as it relates to the seller. So depending on the character of the seller, their communication style, those are some other red flags that I would try to use to disqualify. In fact, that was why I walked away from the landscaping business. There was some red flags with the seller that I could only assume had infiltrated the business, and it was just something that, I didn't want to deal with.
No, 100%. I think the culture very much so comes from the top. So
Yeah,
if you don't have a good gut feeling about the seller, it's not a good sign.
yeah.
I'm curious, going back to like HVAC, air ducts, air duct cleaning. Um, why did you like that first deal? I guess the air duct deal. What kind of drew your attention to that one?
So the margins were interesting, higher margins, because it's practically just labor that you're paying for in terms of, expenses. And then I think what made it unique to me was my background in the military. So the job that I had for the last 3 years when I was in the military focused around hazardous, decontamination, air decontamination, and things like that. So when I looked at the private sector version of that, and then you try to add on the layer of COVID and disinfecting air quality in a home, air duct cleaning seemed very interesting to me. And then really understanding that that's a bolt-on service that you have in the HVAC space anyway, made it really interesting as well.
But the air duct one was a bigger deal in this case, or is the HVAC one? Oh, that's interesting.
It was, yeah. So the air duct cleaning business was just under 2 million, and then the HVAC business was right at 600,000. So there's quite a large gap between the two.
And what did you like about the HVAC one? Talk about why people love HVAC. Maybe for those
Yeah,
listeners out there who still don't know.
yeah, absolutely. I think here's the thing about HVAC, regardless of where you're at in the country, right? It could be Florida, it could be Maine. You're either going to use heating or you're going to use cooling, one of the two. So when you as a homeowner, or even a renter, if your AC system breaks and it's summertime and it's 90 plus degrees outside, you're going to have that fixed regardless, right? You're going to prioritize that. If it comes to that or your Netflix subscription, obviously the pricing is different, but you're going to prioritize fixing your AC. Same thing if you're in a cold climate. If your heater breaks, your furnace breaks, you're going to have that fixed. So I think that simple Maslow's hierarchy of needs, like looking at that is something that people are going to pay for regardless. That's what made me interested in it. And then when you look across the board for HVAC companies, their performance is fairly consistent, right? There are a lot of long-standing companies that last for decades and decades. So yeah. Not to mention the from, I guess, just if you're looking at it from an investor perspective, the exit opportunities are great, right? When you're thinking about either exiting to PE or exiting to, a large strategic, there's a lot of opportunity there as well. So
No,
those are many reasons why HVAC is interesting to me.
that makes a lot of sense. Speaking of PE, did you face a lot of private equity competition, looking at these deals, obviously in this very sort of hot space?
No, no, and I think that's because my deals were so small, right? At least in the HVAC space, I think PE is coming down to the deal sizes of like maybe 5 million. But you really don't see a lot of PE shops sub 5 million. At least I haven't, in my experience. I haven't seen PE shops going below that. And just from other HVAC business owners I know, they they don't start getting attention from PE shops until they're at the 5 million revenue mark. So that was, so yeah, I think until you're doing deals that big, you probably won't have issues with PE. Although changing climates, they may go further and further down that value chain. So who knows?
No, that's super interesting insight. And was your plan, I guess, is your plan sort of to, have to buy more bolt-ons or to acquire additional ones and kind of roll them up and sell to private equity one day? Or are you doing this for cash flow? Kind of what did you come into this with? So from a, what kind of plan did you have coming into this?
Yeah, so the plan that I had coming into this has changed post operation, right? You mentioned
Interesting.
you mentioned having to deal with operations, and I realized that's like my preference where I'm at in my phase of life. That's not what I prefer doing. So I originally came into this with the strategy of, okay, I'm going to build this as a platform. I'm going to do a bunch of bolt-ons, and then I'm going to exit to PE in some form or fashion. That was the original plan. Now I'm looking at it and saying I want to use this as a consistent cash flow for my holding company, and then I want to use that cash flow to reinvest into other projects, growing the portfolio over time. So instead of a like a singular horizontal type platform, I'm going to do multiple companies within the holding company.
No, that's interesting. I'm curious. I want to learn more about kind of what it's been like post acquisition, but even, before that, with those two deals that, you were kind of closing on roughly, similar times, how did you structure those deals? You mentioned you went SBA, but how did you structure and finance both of the deals?
Yeah. So the capital stack was all personal capital and then SBA 7A loans. And I that was the same capital stack for both deals. Yeah, so
And
pretty traditional, like, nothing fancy.
how
Yeah,
did you
pretty.
structure a deal with the seller? Was there a seller note involved in both deals? None.
No, yeah, no seller note for either one. Neither seller was interested. And one was moving out of the country, another one was moving to another state. They weren't like staying in the local area. So, their own personal preference. But yeah, so the capital stacks, like I said, were pretty straightforward in terms of what the deal structures look like. It was typical 10% down for the SBA 7A, with capital injection coming from my own balance sheet.
But no, that's interesting. And what kind of transition did you negotiate with the sellers?
Both were slightly different. The first one was fairly quickly because he was moving out of the state. So we only spent about a month together before he left, and then just maintain communication from there as needed. That business model was fairly straightforward, fairly simple, and because he wasn't involved 100% with day-to-day operations, I relied heavily on the management team that was in place because that's where a lot of the institutional knowledge was anyway. And then for deal two, he actually stayed on as like as an employee for about 90 days so that I could transition that role into a management position. And then once we got a manager in, we actually, did a left seat, right seat between the two of them, and then transitioned him out.
No, that makes sense. I just learned the left seat, right seat army term, so I'm
Yeah, that
with
is a
it.
military term. Yeah, it's a
The
military term.
military term, yeah,
Yeah,
but no, I love that. Did you feel like that was sufficient? I think a lot of people ask, how is 30 days, is 90 days even enough? Like, can I really learn a business in that period of time? What's your sort of response to that?
I think if you're coming in with experience, like business operation experience, that's enough time. But I think the tricky part is the historical knowledge and the relationships. That's all, and there's no easy solution in my mind where you can solve for that. Because, for instance, the first or excuse me, the second owner, he had been in that market, in that industry for 30 years. And we legitimately had customers who said, well, if he's retiring, I don't want to do business with you guys anymore because I like doing business with him, right? The business was his identity. And so it's hard to decouple that. And those types of things just takes years and years and years to replace. Another thing is, dealing with vendors. Again, he was in the market for 30 years. They knew his kids. He knew about their kids. I mean, it's so intertwined on a personal level that it's hard to decouple that. And I think in some cases, like from my position and how I operated in the company, I wasn't like an HVAC technician, so it wasn't like I was going to the supply house every single day. So the way I built those relationships was more purely from a business standpoint, which is very different when you're like a sole proprietor running your own business, right? People get to know you, not the business. Whereas for us, it was like the reverse of that. So that's very difficult, and I don't think there's a way to make that transition easily at this scale, like at this level.
Interesting. And I guess I'm curious, how did a lot of people always ask when they're thinking of, buying an HVAC business or a plumbing business, but how did you deal with licenses? You obviously
Yeah.
weren't an HVAC technician. How did you
Right.
how did you transition that?
Yeah, so that I mentioned the transition period for the second owner. Um, I had to have an employee who had the license, who held the license for me. And I made that transition through the employees from business one to the seller, or the seller for business two, and then ultimately to the HVAC manager that I brought on, that's been with me ever since. So until I get my own license, that's actually how we're operating. And it's through in California, it's called a responsible managing employee, an RME. But yeah, that's how that's handled.
That's interesting. And one other question before we kind of talk about after you guys have closed, but um, a lot of people who are thinking of buying a business and looking at the SBA 7A path, face sort of this head-on issue with the personal guarantee. How did you feel comfortable taking on a personal guarantee, or I guess two in your case? Um,
Yeah.
you also mentioned you just had a baby, so how did you come to terms with that or get comfortable with it?
I don't think anybody gets comfortable with it, right? I think that's the easy answer. But listen, you do what you have to, right? I think, and I've talked about this before, but going into this, I didn't really have the pedigree that, say, an HB or like an MBA from Harvard might. I didn't have the same network, so that means I have to take risks that they don't necessarily have to take because maybe they're coming with a larger investor pool where I was not, right? So all factoring all of that in, you kind of have to look at it and say, well, I have to play the game with the cards that I was dealt. Otherwise, I can't play the game at all. And in this case, the cards that I was dealt was having to take on the personal guarantees. In a perfect world, I would raise capital, and I would have used a different type of loan product that wouldn't require a personal guarantee. And that kind of absolves me of some of the personal risk that I exposed myself to.
That makes sense. Let's talk about sort of what happened right after you closed your first deal. I guess the second deal was also maybe closing around then, or even before then. Actually, you mentioned, there were some complications. What were the complications? How did you get past them?
Yeah, so just administrative complications like for deal one, um, there was, and to this day, I actually still don't truly understand how this happened, but effectively the seller was filing taxes, but there was something wrong with his paperwork. So when the bank tried to pull his IRS documentation, it actually looked like he hadn't filed any taxes.
Oh, wow.
And because of that, we couldn't close. And so we were kind of in the 11th hour, we were trying to go back and forth with the banks to figure out like how do we get this across the finish line and actually close. Ultimately, he had to file his accountant had to file some paperwork and get a letter from the IRS stating that he did in fact pay his taxes or file taxes. So that got us across the finish line. But again, that added 2.5 months
Wow.
to our to our timeline. Because anything dealing with the government is always slow.
Yeah.
So just because um and then as that was happening, deal two was also happening. Um, in fact, I was actually ready to close deal two in January, but we put it off until April, mainly because I closed on deal one in January. My son was born in February, and then I closed
Wow.
on deal two in April. So
That is
it was
wild.
it was hectic to say the least.
That is wild. And before moving forward, and how else did you diligence the deal? What did your process look like for those two?
Yeah, so I think pretty standard process. It was my first time, so a lot of lessons learned, definitely. One thing that I'll call out that I didn't do that I wish I would have was a quality of earnings. So I had talked to a few people about doing one, but I decided against it mainly because the thing that the reoccurring theme was, oh, well, these deals aren't that big, so um, you know, maybe it's not necessary. But I think hindsight being 2020, I would have rather have um, done a quality of earnings just for my own peace of mind. But yeah, standard process, you go through all the financial due diligence. So looking at bank records, looking at invoices from the company, matching up deposits, matching up tax returns, like how was this business represented and are the numbers actually accurate? The Q of E would have went a step further and actually validated, a lot of the line items as it relates to um, how accurate the reporting was for those for the revenue. So that's financial due diligence, and then legal due diligence is making sure there's no lawsuits against the company. What is what are there any outstanding liabilities as it relates to legal, those types of things. We did asset sales for both. So, something interesting that I learned is through this process was technically even through an asset sale, certain legal liabilities could follow the deal or follow into new ownership. Um,
Like
Thankfully, none of
what?
that happened.
Like what sorts
Um,
of things?
so not, and I'm trying to. It's been some time trying to think of the explicit example we were working through. Um, but I think if I remember correctly, don't quote me, but if I remember correctly, the example that we were trying to deal with was this tax liability issue. Um, Not the filing of taxes, but whether or not a company was uh, paying tax like sales tax, right? So it came up that if the first owner wasn't charging sales tax like they were supposed to, and then it came about that those taxes come due, well, that could technically transfer over to my ownership as well, which really caught me off guard. Thankfully, the company we're not required to. There's a sales tax exemption on our home service business because we don't sell goods, we only sell services. But that was a lesson that I learned
Yeah.
was if you do have a company that is selling goods, make sure you follow up to confirm that they're charging the sales tax they're supposed to and they're paying the taxes they're supposed to, so that doesn't follow over to your ownership. Um, yeah.
No, that's interesting. That's definitely not expected. I'm sure a lot of people wouldn't know that. But no,
Yeah.
good call out. I'm curious now, moving into sort of after you guys closed. What were the first 90 days like? Yeah, actually, this is such a tumultuous time in your life, right? You
Yeah.
closed one deal, you mentioned you had a baby, and then you closed the second deal. What did those, maybe it's like that 4 to 6 months. What did that look like?
Yeah, so 4 to 6 months is probably better because I felt like by the time we were, I was getting my feet under me with operations number one. We closed on the second deal, and then I had two sites, and I had to do the merger, and that just kind of restarted the process. But really, I think it's observational period, right? I and there's two perspectives here. A lot of conventional wisdom will say, don't make any immediate changes in the first 90 days, just observe. And that's kind of the wisdom that I followed. There is other wisdom that says, that the company is ripe for change when ownership happens, the ownership transition happens. So that's actually the best time to make change. You know, I'll
Polar
leave that up
opposites.
to
I love that.
polar opposite, polar opposite. Um, I am now of the camp of make immediate change
Oh,
because
interesting.
I did the first one where, I spent, 60, 90 days observing, really trying not to rock the boat too much. Really the only change that I made was implementing some software, and stuff like that. So I tried to keep it as intact as I possibly could. Um,
And what changes
and
would you have made if, hindsight 2020, what would you have changed immediately?
um, process procedures, I would have changed some of the management structure. I would have changed pay rates. Um, a lot of the employees, and ultimately we had to part ways with a lot of these employees, but they were overpaid for the amount of responsibilities they had in the business.
Mm.
So, you know, um, yeah, those were some immediate, I think, changes that would have been a net positive effect would have had a net positive effect on the business.
No, that's interesting. And how are you managing both businesses as you like just, close the first one and then the second one you had to now were two separate places? Did you focus on integrating at that point? What did that look like?
Yeah, so the post post acquisition for deal two, the owner stayed in place. So that was really a benefit because it like on day one, effectively nothing changed other than ownership. I mean, he showed up with the team and continued business as usual, with the exception of having like me in the reporting chain. Um, and the office sites were an hour and a half apart.
Wow.
So yeah, so for the first, 6 months, I spent a lot of time just commuting back and forth, trying to be on site with both teams, getting to know the employees, getting to know what their, daily structure looked like. Um, and then it wasn't until probably 6 months into ownership that the merger actually happened. And I brought like the CRMs under one CRM, like started combining communications and things of that nature. So, yeah, I mean I mean even everything from like customer service for the first 6 months was kind of channeled to two, depending on which number was called. And yeah, and that's primarily because this business number two, again, the business owner was customer service as well. So if a customer called, it went straight to his personal cell phone.
That's
So it took some time for me to transition that out. Whereas I actually had customer service reps in business number one.
that's
So
funny.
I needed to get them trained up on HVAC because they had only ever dealt with air duct cleaning.
Got it. And did they both, so they both have physical locations. Did you combine those as well, or are they still separate?
Yeah, so Uh, business one actually had an office. Business two did not. They only had a storage site for the vehicles and equipment. So I kept that just because it's an hour and a half away. So I didn't want them commuting,
Right.
both directions. So I just kept that. And yeah, yeah. So.
And has the team like te has have both teams gotten along? Like how has that been sort of culturally integrating the two companies?
They really the interesting thing is they haven't. And it's mainly because two different services, two different geographical locations. Um, we haven't been in a position to do like a all hands company get together where, I mean, we've had cross trainings a little bit, so the employees have gotten to know each other, but not in a way where they're working side by side every day and actually building some type of rapport with one another. So you can almost look at it as two exclusive divisions of one company that's being operated. Yeah.
That's interesting. Once you actually did start making changes to both businesses, I know you said you didn't do it soon enough, but what were some of the, I mean, it's been, I guess not even a year or just a year since that first one closed. What are some of the things you've been focused on? Yeah, what were some of the things you guys focused on?
I think the biggest one is process and cultural expectation. So the biggest change that was quite shuddering to the team was you have a software engineer who's coming in who's very tech enabled. So I'm always looking for areas of opportunity where tech can alleviate, or provide automation or some type of productivity improvement. And that is very different. I mean, when I bought Deal One, they the way they operated their dispatching was all paper based and it was sticky
Wow.
notes on a wall. It was sticky notes on a wall, right? And deal two, the owner literally had the schedule and most of the customer information in his head. Like he knew their addresses. He
That's
knew
crazy.
I mean, in a lot of ways it's impressive, right? Like, granted the company wasn't that big, but still to be able to operate a company and keep most things in your head. He only used his CRM system for invoicing. Everything else was in his head. So for both of those companies, when I started implementing things like, field service management software, having to understand how do you go to an app and input all the details into an app. I mean, it's very arduous at first, and there was a lot of griping and not a lot of cultural buy-in. But like once people started getting used to it, you realize just um, how much pain it alleviates in just all of the end-to-end business process. So I think that's the biggest thing is understanding that there are tools that will improve our lives, not just improve the business, but improve day-to-day life for the employee as well, and getting helping the culture evolve to be more tech enabled.
Has that translated into the bottom line at all in terms of, your own profits since making things more efficient? What does that look like?
It did, yeah. I mean, you see, like last summer, there was, I think, a 40+% increase in our volume. And again,
Wow.
the reason for that is when you're not doing everything paper based or in your head, you're able to take on more. You're able to schedule out further, right? When I first bought the first business, they would only schedule 2 days out. And it was mainly because it became too complicated to try to keep up with all the papers and figure out, it was just too complicated. So they tried to keep it like 2 to 3 days maximum, whereas during the summer last year, we were scheduled 2 weeks out. And that's 2 weeks across Orange County and San Diego County. And I mean, yeah, so it really does change the way you can operate your business.
That's crazy. And have you focused on growth a lot since, or have you sort of shifted to that, or what's that look like? Or you guys just said this, you
Yeah,
don't need to think about that.
yeah, yeah. I mean, going into 2025, really doing a lot of structural changes to the business, focusing on profitability. Um, the first year, there was a lot of things with the merger that I didn't really anticipate, like the cultural adoption and evolution, that I didn't necessarily factor into how much that would affect operations. Um, so this year we're really trying to nail down um, systems and culture for to improve profitability in 2025.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
And what does your day-to-day look like now? I mean, you're sitting in Australia right now, which I guess is a great sign that the business can run without you being there day to day. But what does it look like?
Yeah, so a lot of coordination, a lot of, I mean, I deal with the management team. So, a lot of budget review, P&L review, identifying talent, what does our training evolution look like, trying to coordinate those things, dealing with, I do a lot of networking with other business owners to figure out potential partnerships. So a lot of the strategic work, I don't do a lot of the tactical work. That's what the managers focus on. Like our HVAC manager, he handles the technicians and things like that. So, um, yeah, if I can I'd like to long term get to a point to where I am removed from it almost completely. Although, you know, in reality, the reality of that is it's probably not going to happen, but that's what I would aspire to. And it goes back to what we were talking about before, where I don't necessarily want to focus on one business. I want to look across the portfolio and grow in different directions and, solving different problems.
Yeah, I was gonna ask you about that next. Since taking over the business, what caused you sort of to change your mind from like pursuing an HVAC roll up to now more so building a holding company where you have different cash flowing businesses, I guess maybe even across different industries.
Y- Yeah, it goes back to it's like I started out with I started out with the expectation to grow a holding company. Um, but I think in order, like when I was leaving tech, I was like, okay, I'm done with that world. But to your point, like you said, you always kind of come back to it because that's like where you grow up. And for me, I fell back in love with technology when I left the military and went into tech and became an engineer. And so when I left that, I realized just how much I enjoyed the ideation. I enjoy the 0 to 1. I enjoy solving different problems. Whereas when you're operating one business, you're it's very hard for me personally to not kind of look at the shiny object and say, "Oh, let's go investigate this interesting technological thing." And so I realized like I just need to play to my own strengths, and leverage that to go do other projects in parallel. Does that mean the companies will grow as big as they possibly can? Yeah, probably not. But it really has changed like my perspective on what my North Star is. So from here, the goal is optimize profits, optimize systems, and put myself in a position where I can work on interesting projects with other people. I think a really great example for listeners who are interested, a really great example of this model is Michael Girdley, who his holdco is, I think he's got a 9-figure holdco, and I think what he may be well over 20 companies at this point. I actually don't know how many he's a part of, but I've really enjoyed watching and learning from his model, where a lot of the companies he starts, he's not even the majority owner. It's he brings in people who are ambitious, younger, really they want to solve a problem, and then he advises coaches, mentors, and invests in those people to help go solve a problem with them that they want to solve. So I think that model is really interesting.
Yeah, I think it's a great time leverage, something to
Yeah,
aspire to.
yeah, for sure, for sure. Yeah.
Well, and do you see yourself, making additional acquisitions in the future? Maybe it's just too soon now, but curious your take there.
Yeah, so I think similar to what you're saying, I think the acquisition skill set is something I will use. I don't know that I personally will go be like owner operator again, maybe in the future I would, especially like in Australia, ETA is very much in its nascency stage. So there's a lot of opportunity here in Australia. So I think it's one of those things where I could leverage the skill set that I have to maybe raise a fund and invest in that way, or do some interesting projects with other people. But I don't think I'll ever go and be an owner operator again. Um, I'd like to move into more of the investor advisor type role.
That makes sense. That's how I feel. So that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Dominic, I know we're at time, but one final question. Any sort of final pieces of advice for those of listeners out there who are maybe still looking, still thinking about whether this is the path they want to go down, maybe where you were, say, 2 years ago. What do you have to say to them?
I will say a lot of um, influencers in this space will implicitly pressure you to do a deal. They say, don't have analysis paralysis, don't be scared, you just get a deal done. From somebody who, maybe because of my military background, maybe because from my tech startup background, I like to move fast naturally. It's who I am. Um, I will actually tell you to take your time, right? Like you really have to do a lot of soul searching when you're doing this because I've met a lot of people who are in this space who can give you the dark side of what it means when you become a business owner. Like, for instance, you can have a 6 month old at home, but guess what? You're still going to get calls at 9 p.m. on Saturday night. And I think that detail is missed a lot of times for people who are ambitious in the ETA, like in their ETA journey. So take your time, really do a lot of introspection, and make sure you understand what the lifestyle means post acquisition. You have to be okay with that. Don't do it for the sake of doing a deal. Do it because you're ready for that next phase of your life.
I think that's fantastic advice. A lot of people think it ends when they've bought the business, but really that's when it begins. So,
That's when it begins. Exactly.
no, so that's fantastic advice. And I guess final question is, if people want to reach out to you after watching this, where can they find you?
Yeah, LinkedIn is probably where I'm most accurate, I'm most active. I don't spend a lot of time on social media, but yeah, LinkedIn is definitely a great place. Find me, Dominick Blue. And then if people want to send me an email, Dominic@nostragroup.com. I can give you the email to put it in the comments if that's easier. That's probably the two easiest places to find me.
Fantastic. Well, Dominic, thanks so much for your time today. I learned a lot. I'm sure a lot of people feel the same. Fantastic story and excited to see, where these things take you and to keep following your journey.
Thanks. I appreciate it. Yeah. Thanks for having me, Ellen. It's been great. And I look forward to future conversations.